Designing a group policy strategy. Now, group policy is obviously a massively important element of any Windows infrastructure these days, and getting the right design in place will help make sure your group policies are not only effective for management, but that they're actually maintainable and manageable over the long term. So here's what we'll cover. In addition to some basic group policy design strategies, we're also going to talk about inheritance, blocking, and enforcing, slow link and loopback processing, security and WMI filtering, along with just a couple other security related type things, and advanced group policy management. Now, this nugget is focusing on design level. It's those features of group policy, what they do, when you use them, and how they impact your environment. Actually, setting them up is covered elsewhere. For example, in the series for exam 7410, you'll learn about how to configure a central store, how to work with starter GPOs, and how to configure GPO links, as well as some information on configuring security filtering. The series for exam 7411 has got a lot of group policy coverage, probably close to a fifth of it is going to be that, because it's going to cover configuring processing order and precedence, configuring inheritance blocking and enforced policies, configuring security and WMI filtering, configuring loopback processing, configuring and managing slow link processing. All of these things are things we're going to talk about in this nugget, but we're going to focus on the what they do and why you use them. And the series for 7411 is going to focus on, okay, once you've decided to use them, how do you actually set them up? That's also going to cover backup, restore, import, those day-to-day management tasks, as well as delegating actual GPO management. Now, before we kind of jump into all this group policy stuff, we need to talk a little bit about Active Directory, because your Active Directory design actually creates kind of a couple of conflicting priorities within how you create that design. So the structure of your Active Directory, most specifically the structure of your organizational units, needs to serve two purposes. Purpose number one is the delegation of permissions within Active Directory. Purpose number two is the application of group policies. And those two purposes really can sometimes be at odds with one another. So let's talk about the first of those, delegating permissions. Let's say that I have my organization broken down into different physical sites. Here you can see DC, Los Angeles, New York City, Las Vegas. And I want to be able to delegate to an administrative assistant in each of those offices the ability to reset passwords for people in those offices. And let's say for the sales team over here, right here, they've got their own admin assistant both in DC and LA. So what I'm going to do is on those organizational units in Active Directory, I'm going to delegate the reset password permission to those administrative assistants. Now that's going to give them the ability to reset the passwords for any user accounts that are contained within those organizational units. So that's a pretty realistic thing to want to do. It helps offload some of your IT management issues. Now the problem comes into play when I also want to apply group policy in that fashion. For example, let's say that I want to apply a group policy object to everyone in the DC office, regardless of who they work for. Well, that's actually pretty straightforward, because a group policy can be linked to the site that they're all in, and that'll affect everybody who's at that site. And the neat thing is if they leave that site, let's say they get reassigned to a different office or even just temporarily visit another office, they'll stop picking up the settings that were linked to that site. And so that's pretty cool. But it's going to hit everybody at that site. It's going to hit the salespeople that are there, the operations people, the executives. It's going to hit everybody there because it's applied to the entire site. So, all right, what could I do about that? Well, I suppose what I could do is reorganize my entire directory so that my top level OU was for, let's say, DC. That would be the location. And then I could break that down by sales, ops, exec. And in order to get that password permission resetting stuff, I could delegate permission at this level. Yeah, but see, now there's also group policies that I want to assign to the entire sales team. Under this structure, I would presume I would also have an LA office with this same kind of breakdown, sales, ops, exec. So now I'd have to have a group policy object and link it to that OU and that OU in order to hit all the salespeople. Whereas in my old design, I could just link it here and it would hit them all no matter which office they were in. So this is the trade-off you wind up getting into. And what a lot of organizations do is they'll design their Active Directory structure, specifically the organizational units, primarily to meet the needs of permission delegation. Because group policy actually has a bunch of other features that let you kind of get more granular and more specific within the group policy object so that you don't have to rely so much on your organizational unit structure. Now, before we start getting into those features, because we are going to have to look at them all, I want to just briefly refresh your memory on what the group policy order of operation is. And a lot of people will get a little bit confused about this because they'll start thinking about group policy objects overriding each other. Like if you have multiple GPOs hitting you, which one wins? And the answer is, well, none of them win exactly. They all get applied. Here's what I mean by that. Let's say we've got a setting for, let's keep it simple. Let's say the desktop background color, all right? And at the domain level, I've linked a GPO that sets that to blue. Now on the sales OU, actually let's quit picking on them. On the ops OU, I've created a group policy object that sets the color to green. Then on the New York OU, I've created a group policy that sets the color to red. And let's see, let's call it on the New York site. I've configured another group policy object that sets the color to black. So now I've got all of these different colors floating around. Which one wins? In other words, if you're logging on in the New York office and your user account is physically contained in the New York organizational unit, what color is your desktop going to be? Well, the first group policy that hits you is the domain. So now your desktop color is set to blue. Then you're going to get your site's group policy object, which is going to change it to black. Then you're going to get the topmost OU that you belong to, which sets it to green. And then you're going to start getting all of the sub OUs down to the one that actually contains you, which is going to set it to red. So it's not that anyone wins, it's just that each one of these gets to successively change the setting, and the last one that gets changed is the one you wind up with. That's your effective setting, or the resultant set of policy, your RSOP. That's the final set of settings that gets applied to your computer simply because they were the last ones to show up and actually change something. And so that is the order of application. Domain first, then the site that you're in, and you can only be in one domain, and you can only be in one site at a time. Then we start working down the OU chain until we get to the most specific OU, the one that contains you, and we apply every group policy object that we meet along the way. Of course, this doesn't just apply to user accounts, because computers also log into the domain. So let's say that for some crazy reason, get my pen going here. Let's say for some crazy reason your computer, your PC was in that OU and your user was in that OU. Now your computer is going to log on to the domain as soon as you start it. It's going to apply this, and let's say you're in this site too. Then this, and then this, and then you're going to log on and get this, 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 and this. Now, the neat thing about group policies is they're actually broken into two chunks. One chunk that applies to the computer and another chunk that applies to the user. So there's not necessarily a lot of overlap, but some settings do exist in both locations. Some settings exist as a machine-wide setting that will apply to the computer and as a per-user setting that only applies to a user account. Because the user settings get applied last, simply because you log on after the computer does, so you're the last one in. If there's any kind of conflict, then it's, again, the last one in. So it would be the user one that won each of those times. So that's sort of the basic application structure. What we're going to start looking at are features that fine-tune this and create a little bit more structure and a little bit more granularity, and quite frankly, the possibility for a ton of complexity that you might potentially have to unravel if you're building these or troubleshooting or whatever else. And this is how you're going to start to build your design for group policy. How do I get the group policy structure that my organization really needs? So I'm really just going to kind of walk through a bunch of these different features and then explain some of the ways that they might be able to help you kind of work out the exact group policy plan you need. Take a look at this group policy object. So just for point of reference, these little icons here, that's a group policy object link. Now that's not the actual group policy object. We're just selecting the link that attaches that particular one, in this case, to the domain. So let's get all that out of the way. And we just actually want to look at the group policy objects themselves. So take a look at this one, because you can see in the top, I've got this one linked to my actual domain, which means it's going to apply to all domain computers, except I've used the security filtering. And I've added the security principles. In this case, they're computer accounts, but they could also be users or, more likely, groups, so that this GPO will only be picked up by the people on this list, the computers on this list in this case. This is one way of allowing your organizational unit structure to reflect your permissions delegations needs while still getting very granular application of group policy. So, I mean, let's say that this was a group policy object that I only wanted to apply to people in a particular office. So I could still delegate permissions to an organizational unit like sales. I could have the group policy object linked to the domain and simply have all of my people in a group and only allow this group policy object to apply to the people in that group, even though it's linked at the domain. So that's one really cool technique that you can use. Another technique, and this applies a little bit more to computers than to people, is to utilize WMI filtering. So you can see here I've created a WMI filter. Now you create these in an entirely standalone way. Let's take a look at the configuration for this one. Actually, we don't need to. It's right over here. I'm executing a WMI query. Now in this case, I'm selecting all. That's a star there, not a broken pixel on your screen, from the Win32_operating system class, and I'm only asking for those instances where the build number is 2600. Now that happens to be the build number for Windows XP, the initial released version. I believe Service Pack 1 made it 2601. So what this is doing is saying that any group policy object which uses this filter will only apply to machines where this returns an instance. So on machines where the build number is not 2600, this query will return nothing, and any group policy objects that use this WMI filter won't apply to that computer. So these WMI filters are actually applied or evaluated at the client. As the computer is figuring out what group policy objects are going to be applied, it takes a look at, in this case, this GPO. It says, okay, I'm ready to apply this, but wait, stop. I see that it has a WMI filter. So if we get out of here and we go look at the actual GPO, you'll see the other side of this configuration. It's all the way down here at the bottom, and it says that this GPO is linked to the following WMI filter. So a single WMI filter can be applied or linked to several different GPOs. A computer is going to hit this. You can see from the security filtering that this is valid for all authenticated users, so everybody, basically. It's linked only to the sales OU, so it's going to be people or computers that are in the sales OU or a sub OU. They're going to download the GPO. They're going to look at the WMI filter. They're going to determine if it applies to them or not, and if it doesn't, they're just going to discard the GPO. So this is another way of creating a higher level linked group policy object and not having it necessarily apply to everything. You can do a lot with WMI. You could target computers with a particular class of processor, a particular number of processor cores, a certain amount of RAM that have a particular application installed. A great deal of computer-wide information is available through WMI. Now, way more even than we're going to cover here. But just understand that that's It's one of the capabilities you have for making a group policy object a little bit more granular than its link location might normally imply. Now, another cool trick you've got, let's collapse this folder and go into this sales OU. Take a look at the East OU. You'll notice that its icon is a little bit different. And if I right-click it, you'll see that it's because I have enabled blocked inheritance. In other words, although the normal order of precedence says that the sales OUs, GPOs, get applied first, and then the East OU gets applied second, I'm actually blocking all higher level group policy objects from hitting anyone who's contained in this OU. The only group policy object they would get from that structure is this one because it's linked directly to this OU. So I'm blocking inheritance. That's another way. Let's say you've got some very high level structure and you've got a bunch of GPOs coming down, and then you get down to a certain point and you're like, the folks here are just special. And I'm going to create a special GPO just for them, and that's the complete set of things I want to apply to them. I want to block everything that came from a higher level. You can do that on a per OU basis right from within the GPMC console where we are right now. There's another side to this, though. You might also say, and this is where you can start to get into really circular references, you might also say, I want to block everything except. There's a couple of extremely important group policy objects that let's say for legal reasons, we have to have those applied. We cannot allow anyone to block those. Okay, let's go up to that GPO, right-click it. Oops, right-click it. Right-click it and click Enforced. See its little icon change there? Let me click off of it so you can see it more clearly. It's a little lock now. It shows up everywhere. That means even though inheritance has been blocked here, this one is going to punch its way through that block. It's the barrier buster, and it's going to apply to folks who are in that OU anyway. So rather than enforced, you can think of it as non-blockable. In fact, in previous versions of the product, they didn't use the term enforced. They used another term that kind of said more clearly non-blockable. So I've blocked inheritance here, but I've ensured that this one is enforced and will go through anyway. So you can kind of work things out however you need to. One of the reasons you might do that is if you've done some delegation over a group policy object. Let's say you've given someone the ability on this OU to block inheritance so that they can kind of control their own world. But there are still a few high-level corporate things that you need to ensure everybody gets. You can set that up with enforced. Of course, all of this can get really, really difficult to play with because you've got filters in place. You've got security filters in place. You've got WMI filters in place. You've got blocked inheritance, non-blockable inheritance, group policy objects coming from OUs, from sites, from domains. It can be really tricky to unravel all that, and that's one of the reasons why you've got group policy modeling. Now, what this lets you do, let me expand this out. I'm going to right-click this, and, well, actually, I've got one here I can just show you. Yeah, okay. So let's go ahead and rerun this query. What this is an example. I've set up some details. I've said I want to look at this particular user logging into this particular computer. I'm making some assumptions about where they are in the domain now. I don't think I changed this to change their location. We can look at the query. No, I didn't specify an alternate user or computer location. I did not enable loopback processing or slow link processing, which we still have to talk about. No changes to the security group of either the user or the computer. I did not change any of the WMI filtering, and so now this query result is going to tell me which group policy objects are actually going to apply when that user logs onto that computer. And it's going to take into account inheritance, blocked inheritance, security filtering, WMI filtering, loopback. It's going to take into account all the different variables and tell me what's actually hitting them. Now, the other approach to that, or in addition to that, you can play with resultant set of policy, and that will show you the individual settings that would have been extracted from all those GPOs. And it's a really powerful troubleshooting tool simply because all these different options and granularity can get a little conflicting sometimes. They can kind of step on one another, and they can get really hard to just unravel in your head. So sometimes it's easier just to go in and actually run a modeling query and see what Active Directory would have done rather than trying to guess. The next two application policies are actually configured in a group policy object. So I'm just going to open any random one here. Now keep in mind, these settings get applied to a computer. You can either push them out with a group policy, which I'm in here, or you can go directly to that computer and edit its local policy, meaning kind of the copy of group policy that it keeps locally. So this happens at the computer level, and the first one we're going to talk about is loopback processing. This will be under administrative templates, system, and then I'll have one called group policy, and then loopback processing is usually at the end of this. Here we go. So double click to open that up. Loopback processing essentially means that when a user logs on, Active Directory goes through its normal process of figuring out which group policy objects are going to apply to that user. And once it has that set, rather than applying the user portion of the group policy object, it can also, or instead of, apply the computer portion of the group policy. And that's the mode here. In replace mode, you only get the computer portion of the group policy objects that apply to the user. In merge mode, you get both. You get both the user portion of the GPOs and the computer portion of the GPOs. This is a really kind of specialized thing, and you typically use it only when you've got a computer that's serving some special role and where you need to configure the computer based upon the user who's logging in. The examples that Microsoft will give you are things like kiosk computers or labs in classrooms, maybe public areas, that type of very, very specialized thing where particularly you might not really be able to identify the user. They might be anonymous. And so you need to have a bunch of computer information settings applying instead. So that's the first one. The second thing we need to talk about while we're in here is slow link processing. Now there's actually a couple pieces of slow link processing, and the first is here, which is where we define what is considered a slow link. Now the purpose of slow link detection is if you're pushing out some group policy objects that are really large, or more likely if they're doing something really large, like deploying software, you might not want those to hit your users who are dialing in. You might want to wait to apply that group policy object to users until they're connected to a local area network, which is faster. You don't want to start shoving software updates down a dial-up line from a hotel room somewhere in Bangalore. So this group policy setting allows you to configure what you consider to be a slow link, and you would specify that in kilobits per second. You can see the default is 500. And you can also say, look, anybody who's coming in over a WWAN link, always consider that to be slow. So this is the first part of this. This is where you define what is a slow link in your organization. Now there are some defaults as to what is applied with slow link detection. So you've got security settings. Let's see, this will be under Windows. Your security settings are always applied over a slow link, although you can configure it so that they're not. IP security is on by default over a slow link. Encrypting file system is on. Software restriction policies, that's up here. Actually that's not, that's under here. Software restriction policies is on by default. And none of those things are large. Your wireless section is on. Administrative templates, everything under here is on by default over a slow link, although you can turn it off in the GPO. Finally, IE maintenance, Internet Explorer maintenance, is on by default. So it's off by default. Software installation, and that's this, over a slow link is turned off. Folder redirection, meaning you've set up a file server and users are getting their profile from that rather than from a local copy. So that's off by default so that it doesn't try to push all that traffic over the slow link. And scripts. So if you get into your login scripts, that's disabled by default over a slow link. Now, the one thing to remember is that that setting for defining what is a slow link applies to both the computer side and the user side of the group policy object. And each one only controls the applications of settings in that half of the GPO, because this can be done both for user and computer objects. So just kind of bear that in mind as you're troubleshooting. Now, there's another couple of cool things you can do with group policy on the security side. So let's take a look at, now I want to be very specific to point out that I'm going to be looking at an actual group policy object, not the group policy object's link within Active Directory. Let's just pick one of these at random. The Boston desktop configuration will do. The delegation tab allows you to give someone else permissions to the group policy object. This is really designed so that you can let someone else manage this. Let's say there's an IT administrator in Boston and you want to give them some control over their settings. You, as the top-level administrator, can still decide where this gets linked to, but you can let them come in and edit it. Now, you can see here by default, only domain admins and enterprise admins, as well as the system, have the ability to edit the settings, but authenticated users has the ability to read everything, and that's actually picked up from the security filtering tab. So if we go over to the scope of this, which tells us where it applies to, this hasn't been linked anywhere, but authenticated users is on the security filtering, and that's why they show up over here. There's a little kind of trick that you can do with group policy objects on this delegation tab, and I don't necessarily like doing this because I think it makes things more complicated, but it's possible, and I'll show you what it is. We're going to go into Add, and let's grab, I want to grab something that's not going to be too dangerous to play with. How about domain users? And we'll check names, good. We'll add them. What permissions do we want to give them? Well, we can read, we can let them edit settings. So this is another place where you can give someone permissions to read a particular group policy object. I would typically rather do this on the security filtering tab than doing it directly here, just because I think it makes more sense to have this scope tab show every place this could apply. So if we click over on this now, you'll see that the security filtering section doesn't list domain users, although this will apply to domain users. And it's because I specifically added it on this delegation tab rather than adding it via security filtering. Be aware of that, because you may have an existing environment where someone went in and did this. You might just be looking at the scope tab and think, well, it's not going to apply to that group, because you didn't look over here and realize that it's been added kind of manually behind the scenes, I guess is one way to think about it. So I can pop this dialog box up and get a little bit more specifics on, who's in here and everything else, and that can tell me who's actually able to read this thing. So you can do a nice little drill down right from there. And now here's the really tricky part. I'm going to make sure I'm clicked on that. I'm going to click Advanced. And remember before, I really only got 3 sets of permissions offered to me: read, edit, really. Here, I'm getting a full permissions dialog box, and I can deny readability. Now, this is a really, really evil, tricky thing to do, because it makes this group policy object really difficult to troubleshoot, because you have to dig so deep to get that permission. I'll show you what it looks like when I click OK. Let's let that process for a second. And you can see that it's really tough from this screen to actually see what's happening. But the practical effect of that is that if I were to link that group policy object somewhere in my domain, all users are members of domain users, and so I would expect everybody to pick up that group policy object, but I've just denied them the ability to even read the actual file itself. So it will look like it's there, and it will look like it should be applying, but it won't. Now, if you were to go down to group policy modeling and run a model, it takes that into account, which is why I say you almost can't rely on this console to predict what group policy objects are going to apply to someone. You really need to come down and run a model query on it, because that's going to take into account all the little difficult to see things that can make it tricky. But remember that as a troubleshooting tip. If you're looking at a console and there's a GPO there and you're thinking, well, everybody should be getting that. I haven't blocked inheritance. I haven't done anything crazy. I'm looking at the scope tab and it says it should apply still, but it's still not applying. Well, you need to check the permissions. And it's entirely possible that there's just been a deny put there. That's something that I've seen some administrators really utilize a lot in their environments, and it's scary because it is tough to troubleshoot and tough to unravel. So the last item on our hit parade is the Advanced Group Policy Management, or AGPM console. This is part of the Microsoft Desktop Optimization Pack, which is something normally available to Microsoft customers who are on an enterprise agreement or who otherwise have software assurance. Now, I'm not going to show you how to use this thing. For the purposes of the 7013 exam, you primarily need to be aware of its capabilities and the problems that it tries to solve. First amongst those is the idea of a secure versioned repository, meaning you can put a lot more control around who can get to your GPOs, and most importantly, every time they're changed, it automatically keeps a backup of the prior version, so that if somebody messes something up, you've got a very easy way to roll back to the one that used to work. Now, normally when you edit a GPO, there's no save button anywhere. As you're clicking stuff, you are changing the live file on a domain controller, typically your PDC emulator in your domain. That is then replicating out from there. It's entirely possible, because all your client computers are periodically refreshing their group policy object inventory. You could be editing something and have it start popping up live on other computers almost immediately. And it'll continue popping up on them as more of them continue to refresh. So you're messing live with your production environment. Crazy talk. Part of what Advanced Group Policy Management does is give you offline editing of GPOs, along with a review, test, deploy workflow, so that you can edit the GPO without it being live, let a colleague or a peer review it to make sure you haven't screwed anything up, just get another set of eyes on it, put that out into a test location so that you can run some tests and make sure it works, and then deploy it. And even then, if it messes up, you can use the versioned repository to roll back to a previous version. Another great thing that the Advanced Group Policy Management gives you is difference reporting. You can point it at two different group policy objects, and it will show you what the differences are. That lets you diagnose and even prevent problems a lot more quickly. It also gives you a lot of enhanced diagnostics capabilities, so you get fewer issues. I mean, that's what this is really all about. As group policy becomes more and more complicated, it gets more and more difficult to manage. And so this is just a management tool that's designed to help solve some of those problems. So I think we've covered everything. We did look at inheritance and blocking and enforcing. We talked about slow link and loopback processing. Looked at security and WMI filtering, as well as some other security-related strategies for group policy, and talked briefly about the capabilities of the Advanced Group Policy Management module. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.